The morning shift had just begun on Kepler Station when the first alarm sounded. Dr. Amanda Collins was pouring her second cup of coffee in the observation lounge, watching the distant pulsar spin its ancient light across the void. She loved these quiet moments before the research teams filled the corridors with chatter and the hum of scientific equipment. She never got to finish that. Coffee, the Vethrani warships appeared without warning, dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation. 12 vessels, each one larger than the station itself, arranged in a crescent pattern that blocked any hope of escape. Their hulls were dark purple, almost black. It's covered in angular symbols that glowed with pale blue light. Station. Commander Richard Hayes saw them first on the sensor display. His blood ran cold. The Vethrani Dominion was known throughout the galaxy as a proud and ancient species, rulers of 37 star systems and conquerors of a dozen others. Humanity had no quarrel with them. There had been no disputes, no conflicts, not even a harsh word exchanged in diplomatic channels. He opened a communication frequency immediately. Vethrani vessels, this is Kepler Station. We are a civilian research outpost operating in neutral space under Galactic Collective Charter. Please state your intentions. The response came not in words, but in weapons fire. The first barrage struck the station's eastern habitat ring, tearing through metal and glass like paper. 300 people died in that instant, their bodies pulled into the vacuum before they could even scream. Amanda Collins watched in horror as the observation lounge's windows cracked, then shattered. She was thrown backward, her lungs burning, her vision fading to black dot. Commander Hayes managed to send one final transmission before the second barrage hit. It was short, desperate, and it would echo across human space for generations. This is Kepler Station. We are under attack. Unprovoked. No warning. God help us all. The station broke apart in 7 minutes. 2,847 souls, including 412 children, ceased to exist. The Vethrani ships remained in position for another hour, systematically destroying every escape pod. Every piece of debris large enough to shelter a survivor. They were thorough. They were merciless. And when they were finished, High Commander Zoroth transmitted a formal notice to the Galactic Collective explaining that the humans had built their station too close to a sacred Vethrani burial moon and had therefore been cleansed according to ancient tradition. He expected no consequences. The Collective was a diplomatic body, not a military one. Young species like humanity always backed down when faced with the might of established powers. This was simply how the galaxy worked. The news reached Earth 6 hours later. President Laura Mitchell was in a security briefing when her chief of staff, a steady man named Christopher Yang, interrupted with a pale face and trembling hands. He said nothing. He simply handed her a tablet displaying the sensor logs from Kepler Station's final moments. She watched in silence. Her expression did not change. But those who knew her well noticed that her hands had begun to shake, and her eyes had taken on a quality that made even hardened military advisors uncomfortable. "Get me the Joint Chiefs," she said quietly, "and clear my schedule. All of it." Across human space, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Families who had lost loved ones collapsed in grief. News networks played the final transmission on repeat. Social media erupted with rage, fear, and demands for action. In 1,000 cities on 100 worlds, humans gathered in public squares, holding candles and photographs of the dead. On the diplomatic front, Ambassador Daniel Porter was already at work. A former prosecutor turned diplomat, Porter had spent 15 years building relationships within the Galactic Collective. He knew every species, every faction, every subtle current of galactic politics. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that the Collective would do nothing meaningful to punish the Vethrani. The emergency session confirmed his fears. Counselor after counselor expressed sympathy for humanity's loss, and immediately pivoted to calls for restraint and dialogue. The Mirathi urged patience. The Korvathi suggested mediation. The Thesan hegemony, which had its own troubled history with the Vethrani, remained conspicuously silent. "The Galactic Collective recognizes the tragedy at Kepler Station," announced Secretary General Vorath. a towering insectoid being with 7 eyes and no discernible capacity for empathy. We encourage all parties to engage in restorative dialogue and seek a peaceful resolution to this unfortunate incident. Unfortunate incident, nearly 3,000 dead, including children, and the galaxy's governing body called it an unfortunate incident. Instead, he rose calmly from his seat. The United Earth government thanks the collective for its concern, he said, his voice steady. We will take your advice under consideration. He walked out of the chamber without another word. Back on Earth, President Mitchell addressed the United Nations Space Council in a session broadcast across all human territories. She stood at the podium in simple black clothing, no jewelry, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a severe style that emphasized the hard lines of her face. Citizens of Earth and all human settlements, she began. By now you know what happened at Kepler Station. You have seen the footage. You have read the names of the dead. You have felt the same grief and anger that I feel at this moment. She paused, letting the silence stretch. The Vethrani Dominion has sent us a formal demand. They want an apology for what they call our desecration of their sacred space. They want us to surrender 3 additional star systems as reparations. They believe that we are weak, that we are afraid, that we will bow our heads and accept the murder of our people as the price of existing in their galaxy. Her eyes hardened. They are mistaken. The chamber erupted in murmurs, but Mitchell raised her hand for silence. I will not announce our response today. We will take time to grieve. We will honor our dead with the dignity they deserve. And then, when we are ready, we will answer the Vethrani Dominion in a language they cannot misunderstand. She stepped back from the podium. May God have mercy on their souls, because we will not. The galaxy watched and waited. The Vethrani celebrated what they saw as human cowardice. High Commander Zeroth gave interviews to Dominion media, boasting of how easily the upstart species had been humbled. He spoke of expansion plans, teaching other young races the proper respect owed to their betters. He could not have known that across human space, machine was awakening. Shipyards that had produced merchant vessels and exploration craft were quietly retooling for war. Reserve fleets that had gathered dust for decades were being recommissioned, upgraded, armed with weapons that no alien species had ever seen. Military personnel were being recalled from leave, from retirement. From civilian careers they had thought permanent, humanity had spent 50 years in galactic society, learning, observing, and above all, preparing for the day when the galaxy's cruelty would find them. That day had come, and now the galaxy would learn what humanity had been hiding all along. The dead of Kepler Station would be avenged, not through diplomacy, not through negotiation, but through a demonstration of power so complete and so devastating that no species would ever again consider. Human lives to be cheap, the countdown had begun. 2 weeks passed in silence. The kind of silence that made the galaxy nervous. Human merchant vessels had withdrawn from every major trade route. Diplomatic staff had been recalled from dozens of worlds. Ambassador Daniel Porter, once a constant presence at galactic collective functions, had not been seen in public since walking out of the emergency session. Even human tourists and students had quietly returned home, leaving empty apartments and confused friends across 100 alien worlds. The Vethrani Dominion interpreted this as submission. High Commander Zeroth had been right all along. Humans were weak, soft, too attached to their short lives to risk them in meaningful conflict. They would eventually send their apologies, surrender the demanded territories, learn their proper place in the galactic order. Zeroth prepared his victory address with considerable pleasure. He spent hours practicing before a mirror, adjusting his ceremonial armor, rehearsing the precise tone of condescending magnanimity he would use when accepting humanity's surrender. His advisors competed to write the most elegant phrases, praising his wisdom and foresight. On the 14th day, every diplomatic frequency in the galaxy lit up simultaneously. Every embassy, every council chamber, every news network received the same transmission at the same moment. The signal bore the authentication codes of the United Earth government. President Laura Mitchell appeared on screen. She wore the same simple black clothing as before, but there was something different in her bearing now. The grief was still there, buried deep, but covering it was something harder and far more dangerous. "Citizens of the Galactic Collective," she began. "For 2 weeks, we have been silent. Some of you interpreted this as fear, some as defeat. You were wrong." She leaned forward slightly. "The people of Earth do not negotiate with murderers. We do not offer apologies for crimes committed against us. And we do not surrender our dead unavenged." Behind her, a tactical display activated, showing the positions of 3 human fleets at the edge of Vethrani space. "To the Vethrani Dominion, you have made your choice. You decided that human lives were worthless. You decided that our children could be murdered without consequence. You decided that we would accept extinction rather than fight." Her voice dropped lower. "Now witness ours." The transmission ended. Across the galaxy, diplomats and politicians stared at their screens in stunned disbelief. The Collective Secretary General immediately called for an emergency session. The Mirathi ambassador attempted to contact Porter, only to find all human communication channels closed. Even species that had no stake in the conflict felt a chill run through their governments. Something was about to happen. Something unprecedented. At the edge of Vethrani territory, human First Fleet emerged from slipspace in perfect formation. 47 warships, each one gleaming with technology that made alien observers gasp in confusion. These were not the modest patrol vessels humanity had registered with the Collective. These were weapons of war, built in secret, designed for a single purpose. Admiral Kevin Bradley stood on the bridge of the flagship, a massive dreadnought named Remembrance. He was 62 years old, a veteran of 3 colonial conflicts and 2 peacekeeping operations. He had lost a grandson at Kepler Station, a bright-eyed boy of 7 who had wanted to be a scientist like his grandmother. Bradley did not seek revenge. Revenge was personal, emotional, small. What he sought was justice on a scale the galaxy had never witnessed. "Open a channel to the Vethrani military installations in this sector," he ordered. His communications officer complied. The message went out in clear language, translated into Vethrani dialect. "Attention all Vethrani military personnel. This is Admiral Kevin Bradley of the United Earth Navy. You have exactly 4 hours to evacuate non-combatant personnel from the following installations: Outpost 17, Orbital Station Kareth, and the Zorvon shipyards. Any military vessels that attempt to evacuate will be allowed to depart unharmed. After 4 hours, these installations will be destroyed. This is your only warning." The Vethrani commanders laughed. They actually laughed. The idea that a young species would dare to attack the Dominion was absurd enough. The idea that they would give warning first was proof of their weakness and stupidity. "These humans are fools," declared Base Commander 3vax of Outpost 17. "They announce their attack and expect us to run. We will crush them and send their admiral's head to Earth in a ceremonial box." He ordered all personnel to remain at stations and all weapons to prepare for battle. Similar orders went out from the other installations. Not a single Vethrani evacuated. Admiral Bradley received reports of the Vethrani response and nodded slowly. He had expected nothing less. Pride was a powerful force, and the Vethrani had centuries of pride telling them they could not lose to humans. For hours passed. Admiral, his tactical officer, reported. "Countdown complete." Bradley looked out the main viewport at the distant Vethrani installations, tiny points of light against the stars. Somewhere on those stations, beings who had cheered the massacre at Kepler were preparing their weapons, confident in their superiority. "All ships," Bradley said quietly, "commence operation." What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries. Human weapons technology, developed in complete secrecy over 5 decades, proved to be 3 generations ahead of anything in the Collective's database. Energy projectors that could bypass shields entirely. Missiles that fragmented into thousands of self-guided submunitions. Electronic warfare systems that could take control of enemy vessels from a distance. The 3 Vethrani installations ceased to exist in under 90 seconds. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Outpost 17 was struck by concentrated energy beams, cut through its hull like sunlight through fog. Orbital Station Kareth found its own weapons turning against it. Its computers compromised so thoroughly that Vethrani engineers could only watch helplessly as their defenses ate themselves. The Zorvan shipyards, pride of the Dominion's industrial capacity, was reduced to glowing debris by a missile swarm that no point defense system could track. 8,000. Vethrani military personnel died. Not a single human ship was damaged. The First Fleet held its position, broadcasting a simple message on repeat: "You were warned." Across the galaxy, governments scrambled to reassess everything they thought they knew about humanity. The species they had dismissed as young, naive, and militarily insignificant had just demonstrated capabilities that rivaled the most advanced civilizations in known space. Where did they get this technology? Demanded the Korvathi representative at an emergency council session. Who has been supplying them? Ambassador Porter, who had returned to the collective chambers for this precise moment, allowed himself a small smile. No one supplied us with anything. We built it ourselves, quietly, over 50 years. While you all assumed we were harmless, he stood and addressed the chamber directly. The Vethrani murdered nearly 3,000 of our people, including 400 children. They offered no warning, no mercy, and no remorse. They expected us to accept this, to bow, to surrender. His voice hardened. We are not a species that accepts the murder of our children. We never have been. And now, the galaxy knows exactly what that means. On Veteran Prime, High Commander Zoroth received the news of the destroyed installations with something approaching panic. His victory address would never be given. His ceremonial armor would never be worn in triumph. Instead, he faced a reality that his entire worldview rejected as impossible. The humans were coming, and they could not be stopped. The Galactic Collective had never seen anything like this. In 10,000 years of recorded history, young species did not wage war against established powers. They negotiated, compromised, submitted, and eventually integrated into the existing order. This was the natural way of things. It was how civilization functioned. Humanity had not read that particular rulebook. The emergency session stretched into its third day. Representatives from 47 species argued, debated, and occasionally threatened each other over what should be done. The Mirathi Consortium urged immediate intervention to protect the Vethrani. The Korvathi demanded neutrality. The Thesan hegemony, still silent, seemed to be watching with something disturbingly close to satisfaction. Counselor. Tethan of the Mirathi finally cornered Ambassador Daniel Porter during a recess. She was a slender being with iridescent scales and 3 sets of eyes, known for her diplomatic skill and her genuine desire for peace. Porter had always liked her, as much as he liked anyone in this chamber of careful words and hidden agendas. Ambassador, she said, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones of Mirathi concern. Your people could have simply demanded compensation. The collective would have pressured the Dominion into paying reparations. Trade sanctions, diplomatic isolation, all the tools we have used for millennia. Why this war? Porter looked at her for a long moment. He thought of Amanda Collins, the scientist who had loved watching pulsars. He thought of Richard Hayes, the station commander who had used his final breath to send a warning. He thought of the 412 children whose names were now carved on memorial walls across Earth, because the next species that considers murdering human civilians needs to understand exactly what that decision costs, he said. Not in credits, not in territory, in everything. Tethan's scales rippled with distress. But surely there are limits. Surely you would not exterminate the Vethrani entirely. We would not, Porter agreed. Humanity does not commit genocide. We never have, and we never will. But we will dismantle their capacity to harm anyone ever again. We will break their military so completely that they will spend centuries rebuilding. And we will do it in a way that ensures every species in this galaxy thinks very carefully before raising a weapon against our people. He turned back to the chamber doors. You wanted us to be civilized? To negotiate? To accept the murder of our children as the price of galactic membership? But you forgot something, counselor. Civilization is not weakness. It is controlled strength. And we are very, very good at controlled strength. The human campaign continued with terrifying precision. Admiral Bradley's first fleet pushed deeper into Vethrani territory, joined now by the Second Fleet under Admiral Nicole Reyes and the Third Fleet under Admiral Samuel Grant. Together, they represented the largest military force humanity had ever deployed. Yet they moved with surgical care that confused Vethrani strategists completely. Human ships did not attack civilian worlds. They did not bombard population centers or destroy infrastructure that supported ordinary Vethrani lives. Instead, they targeted military assets with perfect accuracy, shipyards where warships were built, academies where soldiers were trained, command centers where orders were issued, weapon factories where instruments of death were manufactured. Each strike followed the same pattern: a warning broadcast, giving non-combatants time to evacuate. Then, whether the warning was heeded or not, destruction so complete that nothing remained but debris. Admiral Reyes had developed the targeting protocols herself. A former intelligence officer, she understood that the goal was not conquest but deterrence. Every military installation destroyed was a mise. Sage. Every warning broadcast was a chance for Vethrani commanders to save their own people. When they refused, their deaths became their own responsibility. "We are not butchers," she reminded her crews during a strategy briefing. "We are teachers. We are teaching the galaxy what happens when you slaughter innocents. We are teaching the Vethrani that their pride is not worth their civilization. And we are teaching ourselves that strength and mercy are not opposites." Admiral Grant, commanding the Third Fleet on the southern approach, was a different kind of leader. A quiet man who rarely spoke and never raised his voice. He had spent 30 years studying alien military doctrine. He knew every tactic the Vethrani had ever used, every strategy they had ever developed, and he exploited that knowledge with cold efficiency. When Vethrani admirals expected him to attack from one direction, he came from three. When they prepared for a direct assault, he used long-range weapons that struck before they could react. When they tried to coordinate their defenses, his electronic warfare specialists turned their communication networks into chaos. The Vethrane had never fought an enemy like this. Their previous conquests had been against species with inferior technology and predictable tactics. Humanity offered neither advantage. 4 months into the war, High Commander Zorath finally attempted negotiation. He sent a formal transmission to Earth, offering to return any surviving prisoners from Kepler Station and pay significant reparations in rare materials and technology. The response came directly from President Raziz. "Mitchell, there were no survivors at Kepler Station. You made certain of that. Your offer is meaningless." Zorath tried again, offering to surrender 3 of his own star systems, territories that had taken the Dominion centuries to conquer. The humans declined. He offered to execute the officers directly responsible for the Kepler attack. The humans declined. He offered personal apologies, formal ceremonies of contrition, anything that might end the relentless advance of human fleets. The humans declined everything. "They do not want victory," Zorath told his remaining admirals in a private session. "They do not want territory or resources or submission. What do they want?" None of his advisors had an answer. They had studied human culture, human history, human psychology. They understood the words humans used to describe their goals. But they could not comprehend, on any meaningful level, what those words actually meant. Justice, accountability, remembrance. The Vethrani had forgotten what these concepts meant. They had ruled unchallenged for so long that the idea of consequences for their actions had become abstract, theoretical, something that happened to lesser species. Now they were learning. And the lesson was written in the burning wreckage of their military might. By the 6th month, the Dominion's industrial capacity for war had been reduced by 80%. Their fleet had lost over 300 vessels. Their officer corps had been decimated, both by combat losses and by a growing wave of defections as younger. Vethrani began to question whether their leader's pride was worth dying for. Subject: species that the Dominion had conquered and absorbed over millennia began to sense opportunity. Rebellion stirred on a dozen worlds. The Vethrani, who had always maintained control through overwhelming force, found themselves unable to suppress these uprisings while simultaneously fighting humanity. The galaxy watched in stunned fascination as an ancient empire crumbled. And in diplomatic chambers across known space, representatives quietly revised their assessments of the young species called humanity. They were not weak. They were not naive. They were not harmless. They were patient, methodical, and absolutely unwilling to accept the murder of their people. And that, perhaps, made them the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever seen. 7 months after the destruction of Kepler Station, the Vethrani Dominion existed in name only. Their once mighty fleet, which had terrorized a quarter of the galaxy for 10,000 years, was reduced to a desperate defensive formation clustered around the homeworld. Vethran Prime, seat of the Dominion's power, heart of an empire that had seemed eternal, now watched the stars with fear rather than pride. Admiral Kevin Bradley's combined fleet held, positioned just outside weapons range, patient as death itself. Human ships moved in slow patrol patterns, their sensors tracking every vessel that approached or departed. They did not attack civilian transports. They did not fire on hospital ships or refugee carriers. But any military vessel that attempted to escape was destroyed with cold efficiency. The blockade was absolute. Inside the Dominion's capital, chaos reigned. High Commander Zorath had retreated to his private fortress, surrounded by loyal guards who grew less loyal with each passing day. The Vethrani people, who had celebrated the Kepler massacre as a glorious victory, now demanded answers. They demanded explanations. They demanded someone to blame for the catastrophe that had befallen them. Zorath had plenty of blame to offer, but none of it reflected on himself. The admirals had failed him. The ship designers had failed him. The intelligence services had failed him. Everyone and everything had failed him, except, of course, his own judgment. It was a familiar pattern. Tyrants throughout history, across every species in the galaxy, had followed the same path when their power crumbled. Denial, blame, paranoia, and eventually, violence against their own people. But the Vethrani were not a species without courage. Among the noble houses and the reformed factions and the young officers who had never believed in the old ways, movement was growing. They called themselves the Restoration, and their goal was simple: remove Zorath, end the war, and save what remained of their civilization. While the political storm raged on Vethran Prime, the Galactic Collective made one final attempt at peace. A delegation of 6 species, led by the Mirathi, and including representatives from every major power in known space, traveled to meet with both parties. Ambassador Porter received them aboard the human flagship with formal courtesy. He served them refreshments from Earth, explained the proper use of coffee and tea, and listened patiently to their pleas for a ceasefire. The Vethrani have offered unconditional surrender, Counselor Tethan explained. They will disarm completely. They will pay any reparations you demand. They will submit to whatever terms you wish to impose. Surely this is enough. Porter set down his coffee cup carefully. Admiral Bradley makes the military decisions, but I can tell you what the President has authorized. He looked at each delegate in turn. We will not accept a simple surrender. The Vethrani Dominion conquered and enslaved 12 species over 10 millennia. They committed atrocities that make Kepler Station look mild by comparison. They built an empire on blood and cruelty and the destruction of entire civilizations. His voice hardened. That empire ends now. Not because we want their territory or their resources or their submission, but because no species in this galaxy should ever again live under Vethrani domination. The delegates exchanged uncomfortable glances. What Porter was describing was not conquest. It was not even revenge. It was a fundamental restructuring of galactic power imposed by force of arms. You would make yourselves the arbiters of galactic justice? Asked the Korvathi representative, a crystalline being whose facets shimmered with concern. No, Porter replied. We would remove a proven threat to galactic peace. What comes after is for the collective to decide. But the Dominion's military power ends. Its subject species go free, and High Commander Zoroth faces trial for his crimes. There was no negotiation. There was only acceptance or continued war. The delegates returned to the collective with humanity's terms. After 3 days of debate that accomplished nothing, they accepted. The veteran had no choice but to agree. On Veteran Prime, the Restoration made its move. Military units loyal to the reform movement surrounded Zoroth's fortress. Civilian crowds, tired of war and suffering, filled the streets demanding his removal. The High Commander's guards, seeing which way the wind was blowing, quietly laid down their weapons and opened the gates. Zoroth was captured without a fight. The being who had ordered the murder of nearly 3,000 humans, who had boasted of humbling an upstart species, who had expected to be celebrated as a conqueror, was dragged from his throne by his own people and delivered to human custody. Admiral Bradley received him personally. The High Commander was smaller than Bradley had expected. The Thrani were tall beings, but Zoroth seemed diminished, his ceremonial robes hanging loose on his frame, his 4 eyes darting nervously. Without the power of empire behind him, he was just another old creature facing the consequences of his choices. I demand to be treated according to my rank, Zoroth said, attempting dignity. I am the High Commander of the Vethrani Dominion. I am entitled to diplomatic courtesy and proper respect. Bradley looked at him for a long moment. You are a war criminal, he said quietly. You ordered the murder of civilians, including children. You denied them warning, mercy, or burial. You celebrated their deaths. You threatened to do the same to every human in existence. He stepped closer. My grandson died at Kepler Station. He was 7 years old. He wanted to be a scientist. He wanted to discover new stars and name them after his family. You took that from him? You took that from all of us. Zoroth's defiance crumbled. For the first time, he understood that HFY was not facing a political opponent or a military rival. He was facing something far more personal, far more human. I did not know there were children, he whispered. I was not informed, ... You did not ask, Bradley replied. And that is why you will spend the rest of your existence in a cell, thinking about what you chose not to know. The trial was broadcast across the galaxy. It was not a show trial, not a predetermined verdict wrapped in legal theater. Human legal tradition demanded due process, and due process would be given. Zoroth was provided with defense counsel, access to evidence, and the right to speak in his own defense. He had no defense. The evidence was overwhelming. His own communications, his own orders, his own celebrations after the massacre, all were entered into the record. The trial lasted for weeks, and at its end, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty of crimes against humanity. Guilty of murder. Guilty of genocide. The sentence was not death. Humans had long since abandoned capital punishment for all but the most extreme circumstances. Instead, Zoroth was condemned to spend the remainder of his natural lifespan in solitary confinement on a human prison station orbiting a forgotten moon. He would live for centuries in a small cell, alone with his thoughts. Watching the stars he once tried to conquer passed beyond his reach forever. President Mitchell addressed the galaxy one final time. We take no joy in this. We sought no empire. We wanted only to explore, to learn, to grow alongside our galactic neighbors. The Vethrani Dominion made that impossible. Let their fate serve as a reminder. Humanity will always choose peace. But we will never accept victimhood. She paused, and her expression softened slightly. The war is over. Now begins the harder work, building something better from what remains. We invite all species of goodwill to join us in that effort. The galaxy can be a place of cooperation rather than conquest. But that future must be earned through choice, not forced through fear. She stepped back from the podium. May we all choose wisely. The Vethrani Dominion was finished. But across the galaxy, a new question was forming in the minds of species both great and small. What would humanity become now that they had proven their power? The answer would shape the next 10,000 years. 1 year after the war's end. The galaxy had changed in ways that no species could have predicted. The Galactic Collective, that ancient and creaking institution of careful words and cautious compromises, had reformed itself from the foundation up. A new charter, drafted by a committee that included Ambassador Daniel Porter, established principles that would have been unthinkable just 2 years before. The first and most important provision was informally called the Kepler Doctrine. It stated in clear and unambiguous language that unprovoked attacks on civilian populations constituted an automatic trigger for collective military response. No more endless debates. No more diplomatic hand-wringing. No more watching innocents die while councils argued procedure. If any species attacked civilians without provocation, the collective would respond with force. The same force that humanity had demonstrated against the Vethrani. This was not a human imposition. It was a recognition by species across the galaxy that the old ways had failed. For too long, the collective had allowed powerful civilizations to prey upon weaker ones, hiding behind traditions of non-intervention and respect for sovereignty. Kepler Station had proven where that philosophy led. Never again. Humanity was invited to join the Collective's Security Council, a position of extraordinary influence that had been reserved for the galaxy's oldest and most established powers. President Mitchell accepted, but with characteristic humility. "We do not seek to lead the galaxy," she said in her acceptance speech. "We seek to be good partners in building a future where Kepler Station can never happen again. That is our only goal. That is our only ambition." Ambassador Porter returned to his diplomatic work with renewed energy. The anger that had driven him during the war had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something more constructive. He sponsored humanitarian programs for Vethrani civilians affected by the conflict. Working to ensure that ordinary people did not suffer for the crimes of their leaders, he also championed the membership applications of the 12 species that had been freed from Vethrani domination. These were civilizations that had lived under occupation for centuries, their cultures suppressed, their populations exploited. Now they stood before the collective as free peoples. Seeking their place in the galactic community, Porter personally presented each application, telling stories of what these species had endured and what they hoped to become. Every application was approved unanimously. On Earth, the anniversary of Kepler Station became a day of solemn remembrance. Monuments were built in every major city, black granite walls inscribed with the names of the dead. People came by the thousands, bringing flowers and candles. Standing in silence before the lists of names, the largest memorial was in Geneva, at the headquarters of the United Nations Space Council. A great black obelisk rose toward the sky, surrounded by gardens of white flowers. At its base, an eternal flame burned, its light visible from orbit. The inscription was simple: "We remember, honor, we protect." Admiral Kevin Bradley had retired to a small farm in Montana, far from the ceremonies and the media attention. He had refused all offers of political office, all requests for interviews, all invitations to speak at universities and military academies. He wanted only peace and the chance to watch the mountains change with the seasons. Journalists, who tracked him down, found a quiet man who preferred to talk about agriculture rather than war. When they pressed him about his legacy, he would shrug and look away to distant peaks. "I did what needed doing," he said once, the only quote he ever gave. Nothing more. The real heroes are the ones who rebuild, the ones who forgive, the ones who look at the ruins and see possibilities instead of defeats. He spent his days tending crops and reading old books. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit on his porch and look up at the stars. Somewhere out there, his grandson had dreamed of naming new worlds. That dream was gone now, but perhaps other children would carry it forward. Perhaps that was enough. Admiral Nicole Reyes had taken command of humanity's new frontier defense force, responsible for protecting both human territories and allied species who requested assistance. It was a demanding job, requiring constant travel and diplomatic skill as much as military expertise. She approached it with the same methodical precision she had shown during the war. Defense treaties were negotiated. Early warning systems were established. Training programs were developed to help younger species build their own protective capabilities. "Our goal is to make ourselves unnecessary," she told her staff. "We want a galaxy where every species can defend itself, and where alliances are based on friendship rather than dependency, where no one needs a human fleet to feel safe. It would take generations to achieve." But she had time. Admiral Samuel Grant, quiet strategist who had outmaneuvered Vethrani admirals at every turn, found a different calling. He became the first human instructor at the Collective's military academy on Nexer Prime, teaching alien officers the unconventional tactics that had proven so effective. His classes were wildly popular. Species that had fought the same wars, the same ways for millennia, discovered entirely new approaches to strategy and leadership. Grant taught them not just how to fight, but how to think about fighting, how to question assumptions, how to adapt to unexpected circumstances. More importantly, he taught them that military power was a tool, not a goal, that the purpose of strength was to protect, not to conquer, that true victory was measured not in enemies destroyed but in peace preserved. His students went on to reshape military doctrine across the galaxy, carrying human philosophy into ancient traditions and transforming them from within. The Vethrani Dominion still existed, but as a shadow of its former glory. Stripped of military power and imperial ambitions, they had been forced to confront truths about themselves that generations of conquest had allowed them to ignore. It was painful. It was humiliating. It was also, perhaps, necessary. Young Vethrani began to study their own history with new eyes, seeing the atrocities their ancestors had committed, understanding why the galaxy had turned against them. Reform movements spread across their worlds, demanding accountability and change. Some humans even volunteered to help. Aid workers, teachers, counselors, people who believed that vengeance must eventually give way to healing. They were not always welcomed. They faced hostility and suspicion and occasional violence. But they persisted, believing that reconciliation was possible. It would take centuries. But the journey had begun. On Nexer Prime, at a diplomatic reception marking the first anniversary of the war's end, a young Mirathi student approached Ambassador Porter. She was barely an adult by her species standards, her scales still showing the iridescent patterns of youth. "Ambassador," she said, her voice carrying the harmonic tones of nervous formality. "May I ask you a question?" Porter smiled gently. "Of course. My teachers say that humans are the most dangerous species in the galaxy. They say that your military power could destroy any civilization, that your technology is centuries ahead of anyone else, that you could conquer everything if you chose to." She hesitated. "Is that true?" Porter considered the question carefully. Around them, diplomats from dozens of species mingled and talked, building the relationships that would sustain galactic peace for generations to come. "We're dangerous," he admitted. "We proved that during the war. But we are only dangerous to those who harm the innocent. To everyone else, we try to be good neighbors." The student considered this. "So you do not want power? You do not want to rule?" "No," Porter said. "We want to explore, to learn, to build, to discover. We want to see what lies beyond the next star, and the star after that, and every star until the universe runs out of mysteries." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "We came to the galaxy in peace. We still want peace. But we learned, painfully, that peace must be defended, that kindness must be protected, that children who dream of stars must be kept safe from those who would destroy those dreams." The student's scales shifted to a softer color. "I think I understand." Porter smiled. "I hope you never have to. Truly, I hope your generation never faces what ours faced. I hope you live in a galaxy where Kepler Station is just a lesson in history books, not a wound that still bleeds." He looked out at the gathered diplomats, the rebuilt collective, the fragile peace that humanity had purchased with blood and fire. "But if that day ever comes, if someone ever threatens the innocent again, we will be here. We will always be here, because that is what we learned about ourselves. Not that we are the most dangerous species in the galaxy, but that we will do whatever it takes to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The reception continued around them. Laughter and conversation filling the grand hall. Outside, stars burned in the eternal darkness, countless worlds circling countless suns, each one full of beings who had learned a new truth about the universe. Humanity had come in peace. They had reached out in friendship, and when that kindness was answered with murder, they had responded with a fury the galaxy would never forget. But now, in the silence after the storm, they reached out again, offering not conquest but cooperation, not domination but partnership, not fear but hope, and perhaps, in that offering, lay the foundation for something the galaxy had never known before, a lasting peace, built not on strength alone, but on the understanding that strength must serve a purpose greater than itself. The stars waited, as they always had, and humanity, having proven what it was capable of, turned its eyes toward new horizons. New discoveries, new dreams. The war was over. The future was just beginning.